Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you a little bit about our sponsor, thegreatcoursesplus.com. It's an app you can get on your phone. Here's my phone face. Here's the app. You touch on the app, and it opens it up, and you can just scroll through hundreds and hundreds of courses, which themselves each have a dozen to 24 lectures to choose from. So the great thing about this is that instead of just purchasing or renting an entire course in which you have to then grind through all the lectures to take it, with thegreatcoursesplus.com, you can pick and choose. So I typically now don't listen to an entire course. I listen to maybe half to three-quarters of the lectures, or just find something I'm particularly interested in. So, for example, I just started listening to this one on World War II, the Pacific Theater, after seeing that film on Midway. So you click on that, which I do here, and then you get this whole series of lectures, and you can pick any of them that you want. For example, The Road to War in the Pacific, 1931 to 41. You have the Battle of Midway, of course, and Pearl Harbor, and there's actually a lot that happens after that. There's 24 total lectures. You can listen to them audio or video. I usually listen to them on audio when I'm cycling or driving or just doing chores and whatnot. But the videos are great as well. They've gone to great lengths to provide graphics and photographs and so forth. So that's great. At any rate, it's free for my listeners for a free trial. That is to say, you can go on greatcoursesplus.com/salon and register, and then you get a couple of weeks of free content, and you can skip around and listen to any one of thousands of lectures. I've taught 2 of these courses myself. They're professionally produced in a studio, so the sound quality is great. The visuals are great, all professionally done. And it's really a great way to be an autodidact, particularly when we're in social isolation. So give it a shot. Again, go to www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and then our podcast will get registered as that, and you'll get free access to the entire library for a couple weeks. It's great. So check it out. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Joseph Henrich. His new book is The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. Weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This is one of the best books I've read in a long time. I know I always say something positive about my author's books. Joseph Henrich is an anthropologist and the author of The Secret of Our Success: How Culture is Driving Human Evolution, Domesticating Our Species, and Making Us Smarter. Among other books, he is the chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, where his research focuses on evolutionary approaches to psychology, decision-making, and culture. So I like this book a lot because it's a big history book. It's along the lines of Steve Pinker's books and Jared Diamond's books and Carl Sagan's books. I love all that big picture stuff. He really integrates evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, psychology, social psychology, and sociology, anthropology, archaeology, and so on, and a lot of human history, particularly religious history of religion, which I very much enjoy. It was an eye-opener for me about the effects of the spread of Catholicism and then the Protestant Reformation and after on the kinds of subjects that we're interested here in this podcast, that is science and reason and how it developed. So we also talk about some of the other big books and theories about this, like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, Ian Morris's book on war, What Is It Good For?, Matt Ridley's The Evolution of Everything, Robin Dunbar's Grooming Gossip and the Evolution of Language, the economic historian Gregory Clark's A Farewell to Alms, Benjamin Friedman's forthcoming Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, and Rodney Stark's The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success. So I asked him to comment on all these. I think his book really covers all of those subjects in more in terms of a foundation for what had to be there for the factors that these authors, including myself in The Moral Arc, talk about the influence on history. There had to be something else underlying that for those factors to work. Anyway, very interesting topic, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Joseph Henrich, thanks for coming on the show. The new book is, holding it up for everybody, The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. I love this book. It's really quite an opus. I have to say, I've read all the big books, Jared's books, and and Pinker's books and Dawkins and everybody. And, this is really up in the pantheon of a 10-year project you've been working on. So I thought I'd start off with, my regular listeners will recognize this story from Charles Darwin. In 1861, the British Association for the Advancement of Science held a special session on the origin of species. He wasn't there because he didn't like to go to events like that. And I think one of his kids died. In any case, a friend of his wrote to him and said, "They said your book is too theoretical and you should just put the facts out there and let them speak for themselves." And so here's what Darwin wrote back to his friend, which I then elevated to a dictum at the last part. He says, "About 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. And I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe the colors." And then here's the key. "How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view, if it is to be of any service." So I call that Darwin's dictum. And I think all good scientific writers are writing it against or for some point of view, even if it's one they previously held or their colleagues held, or they're for some part of it or against it. So let's start there. Just tell us, what is this book for or against? What point of view are you attacking or supporting or testing or whatever?
Well, I mean, I've actually written things similar to that in addressing the discipline of psychology. So in some sense, psychology, if you look at a psychology textbook, it doesn't look a lot like a textbook in evolutionary biology, which has an organizing framework and a backbone that Darwin gave us. It's just a potpourri of history of interesting findings in the field. So what I've been trying to make the case is that psychology needs more theory. And what I've laid out in this book is how you can develop theories to explain psychological variation around the world. And in this case, I focused on the society from which my cultural heritage comes from.
Yeah, weird. Right? Yeah.
That's right.
So, but evolutionary psychology, I think of as a search for human universals, even though a lot of its critics feel it's divisive. In fact, if you look at a list of like Dan Brown's human universals, I have an appendix of them in my book, Science of Good and Evil. There was something like 375 of them that he documented. Just to rifle through a few of these: age grades, age status, ambivalence, anthropomorphization, baby talk, belief in the supernatural, and religion. These, again, are universals, that is, without exceptions. Classification of space, classification of tools, classification of weather conditions, conflict, and that's just the ABCs. There's hundreds and hundreds of these. And I think of what you're doing in a way is fine-tuning that list, saying, well, it's not completely universal. The cultures do vary, even though, because you do evolutionary psychology, you seem to be arguing there's an underlying framework, but that culture tweaks the dials on those different universals. Maybe I'm not saying it the way you would, so you pick up on that.
Well, so I agree with that in broad strokes. And so what the book tries to say is actually there are features of human nature. So 3 of them that I bring up early on in the book are pair bonding instinct, kin-based altruism, and incest aversion. And that it's from basic instincts like that institutions begin to be constructed. So the most fundamental of human institutions are those based on kinship and marriage. And so those have formed the bedrock for organization of economics and politics in most human societies across our history. And so part of the story is about how those things became very strong. And in order to build the kinds of impersonal institutions that we have in the modern world, you had to deal with that problem. I mean, cultural evolution had to deal with it. And that growing up in one kind of socially structured world of kin-based institutions, tight social networks, lots of expectations, favors different aspects of psychology than growing up in another kind of world. Another feature that I think is underappreciated, and it's kind of one of the angles I take in evolutionary psychology, is that we're really a cultural species. So it's not this culture is like some kind of window dressing on human nature, but that we've evolved to acquire ideas, beliefs, values, motivations, ways of thinking from other people. And that's part of the way we adapt to the world. So evolutionary psychologists are fond of pointing out that we've been hunter-gatherers for most of our existence. But yet if you drop us into the middle of the Ituri forest or someplace in Africa and tell us survive, we don't do well. And the reason why we don't do well, unlike other species, is because we're heavily dependent on this massive body of cultural information.
Yeah, Jared makes that point in Guns, Germs, and Steel, talking about intelligence that, supposedly, Western thinkers are more intelligent than these hunter-gatherers in Papua New Guinea, where he was hanging out with his colleagues there and friends. But that if you dropped him into Papua New Guinea, he'd be dead in a week or two. It's intelligence is very context dependent, very environmentally or ecologically dependent on the kinds of problems that you need to solve to survive. So you seem to be fine-tuning some of that as well.
Yeah, and so one thing that I want to go beyond is just the idea that, well, we know stuff, so you know where to find food or how to build shelters or how to treat medicine or how to treat injuries or something like that in the local environment, which is a question of knowledge, which is really important. But so recent research comparing hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists shows that hunter-gatherers have a richer array of sense they can detect. So at the level of olfactory senses, there's cultural variation. Having grown up in a particular environment, exposed to a lot of different scents while growing up, you get a better smell for the local sense.
So WEIRD, of course, stands for, as in the cover shows, it's a great cover, by the way, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I remember even as an undergraduate at Pepperdine University in psychology, when I was participating in experiments as a subject, as all intro psych students have to do, and then, later helping my professors run these experiments. I remember thinking, because I would read their papers, this is what Americans believe, or this is what humans do. And I'm thinking, I'm 19 years old. I just moved out of my parents' house. I have never had a real job. How can I possibly represent humans, much less Americans or whatever? So even back then, I remember thinking, so it's great that you identified that when you first coined that acronym back, I guess, about a decade ago. And it's really caught on now. And I think that's an important clarification to make on psych studies, or all of the social sciences, really.
Yeah, and so it's not just though that we want to expand the pool of subjects, but we also want to have, a full accounting, a full evolutionary accounting gives us not only the ability to explain human nature, but also to explain the kind of variation we should see and expect across the world.
So back to Darwin's dictum, let's deconstruct, just have you explain to the listeners what your thesis is, how it differs from other theses, and what problem are you trying to explain? Why the West, accelerated beyond other cultures or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, at the core of the book is really a book about psychology and psychological variation and how we should think about psychological variation. So one of the big ideas is that as a cultural species, having evolved to have these large brains that are ready to drink in ideas from other members of our social group, we can shape how we think and process information. So that means that the institutions we're exposed to, the technologies, the languages, all shape how our brains develop ontogenetically in an environment, and that leads to psychological differences. And then the question is, well, how do we can we explain some of the big patterns? So that should take us to variation institutions. So what institutions vary? I mentioned before that probably the most important of human institutions is the family. And so I began looking at how different family patterns, different marriage patterns, so polygamy versus monogamy, or societies have cousin marriage, some have clans, Westerners have bilateral inheritance, so through both mom and dad, and how this shapes the social networks and then shapes the incentives people face. It leads to different strategies and different ways of organizing the world. So at a high level, it's saying we should pay attention to these things that shape our minds at particular institutions. The one that seems to play a big role in my story is the family. And so part of what made European societies unique is that in the late middle, or in the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, the Catholic Church began to demolish the complex kinship systems of Europe and break people down into monogamous nuclear families. Now, this took centuries, but at least parts of Europe had been broken down by about 1,000 years ago, so 1000 AD. And that led to the development of new institutions, representative forms of government, individual-centered law in the High Middle Ages. And then by the time you get further, several centuries later, you begin to see innovation and economic growth begin to take off. So behind this is kind of an interaction between social structure and psychological change, and creates fertile ground for the development of these other kinds of, formal higher level institutions. I'm thinking of government here.
Yeah, most of us today think of the nuclear family and monogamy as the norm, but as most anthropologists know, it's not the norm, although you have a section called something about polygamy and the problem of math. And as evolutionary psychologists point out, when you have a community in which a handful of men get most of the women, that leaves a lot of young men without a female companionship and nothing else to do but, cause problems trying to adjust that. How is it possible that a polygamous society can operate like that with so many unattached men running around?
Well, I mean, what we know from the anthropological evidence is that if you have a system where the wealthy men are taking a lot of the women, you end up with this large pool of men who, in order to have a chance of getting into the mating and marriage market, they have to take risks. And there are locally socially acceptable ways to deal with that by raiding other groups or by going into war. Or sometimes you get these age set structures where, as a young man, you don't have many mating and marriage opportunities, but assuming you get to be old enough, you can then become polygynous. So it's a kind of deferral of gratification situation. So, I mean, 85% of human societies in the anthropological record allow men to take additional wives. Meanwhile, the opposite, polyandry, is relatively rare, where women can take additional husbands. And those societies are also intermixed with polygyny. So there's a real asymmetry there. And I think that asymmetries are built into human biology.
Why was it Catholicism that first put the brakes on polygamy like that?
Well, I mean, in general, there's variation amongst societies. So you have the emergence of these universalizing religions, say in the 500 years before year zero, say before the Common Era, and the way I think about it is we often look, like in one of our Western models, is we look for the genius or the heroic inventor. So we tend to look for the people who figured it out through some kind of deductive and reasoning process. A kind of more Darwinian way of looking at it, a more kind of population thinking, would be to say there's lots of different religions. They're all doing different crazy things. So Zoroastrianism is encouraging incestuous marriage. So a lot of cousin marriage, brother-sister marriage amongst the royals. Islam eventually they constrain polygyny down to 4 wives. They have to be treated equally. But then they have an inheritance rule that says daughters have to inherit half of what sons inherit. And this leads to parallel cousin marriage. So you got to marry your father's brother's son if you're a woman. And that creates a whole different set of kind of network dynamics. So, and these different groups are just playing with them. They can't tell what the long-term consequences are going to be. And one particular group, the branch of Christianity that led to the Roman Catholic Church, seemed to pick up a bunch of these. And one of them was not only monogamous marriage, because this was common in the Roman Empire, but no divorce, no marrying relatives, and in particular, and also no sex slaves. So Roman men could only marry monogamously, but they could get divorced easily, and they could also have as many sex slaves as they could afford, basically.
So that, But the Romans were not weird like us, even though they practiced some of those. So what made the rules imposed by the Catholic Church on these European countries become weird? What was the kind of historical trigger? And was it for moral reasons, or was it more practical? Like they could inherit more money and control more property?
Well, there's kind of layers of explanation. So at the time, individuals were often justifying that by the obvious reason why you would want to adopt these religious prohibitions, because God wants us to do that, right? But then the anthropologist Jack Goody has argued that the imposition of these rules helped to generate income. So, for example, this doesn't have to do with monogamy, but rules about marrying relatives was eventually used to generate income. And these things also, one of the problems with inheritance was that, if you had a normal kinship system, the way lots of places in the world do, if you died, your relatives would all have claims on your inheritance, and you couldn't control where it went. So the church worked hard to make sure individuals could give their wealth away by testament, and they had to tie it to the lineage, to the sort of, your uncles and cousins couldn't get a hold of it. And this made the church wealthy as people began to bequest money to the church at their deathbed in order to get into heaven. So the people believed that this was a way to get into heaven, but the church was able to gain a lot of wealth and with the idea of giving to the poor. So it built on this thing that Jesus said about, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than to get a camel through the eye of a needle. And so the Archbishop of Milan and others kind of built that Catholic Church on that.
Yeah, it does revolve much around power and money for sure. So you mentioned that Jared's Guns, Germs, and Steel kind of leaves off around 1,000 or so. That is the geographical determinants or factors that divided the West from the rest. And so you pick up around that time, let's say late Middle Ages to the early modern period, where the pervasiveness of Catholicism and these rules against polygamy and all the complex rules about who you can marry and have children with and so on really take off. Then explain to us how that rewires our brains and makes us more analytical and Western in our way of thinking about the world.
Yeah. So the key is to think about how these different family structures affect how you navigate the world. So if all you have is a monogamous nuclear family, and when you go out into the world, whether it's making friends, finding mates, or starting, business partners, people to work with, the thing you have to sell are these attributes. So it forces you to cultivate a uniqueness to make others want to work with you or marry you or whatever. So it focuses you on yourself and what you have to offer others. In a world of intensive kinship, you inherit a lot of relationships at birth. And then if you want to pick someone to be a partner with, you want someone who's attached to you through your networks. Because what's going to make them trustworthy is if they're not, then you can tell their father or tell their brother, and they get a bad reputation within that network. So it's just two different ways of managing things. One is based on relationships and these enduring connections that you keep your whole life. You often have an ancestral land. You see yourself as linked to ancestors back in time. Whereas in the other world, you're an individual and you got to go out and make your way in the world. And I argue that affects how people think about laws, because they start thinking about individuals as having properties. So like in the modern world, we have a notion of individual rights. It's kind of a strange concept that there are these things inside of us that somehow special. And that's not the way that lots of societies have thought about it. They focus more on relationships. In fact, in China, for example, if you were to do battery to someone, you beat them up, your penalty would depend on who you beat up. If you beat up your father, it's much more harshly than if you beat up a stranger. So the relationship matters.
Yeah, I love that section talking about universal human rights, because, of course, it's something I believe in and have written quite a bit about. And I think, prescriptively, it's something we should work toward. But if you asked if I grew up in some other completely different, non-weird culture, I may not be thinking that. So, for example, if you ask me, who are you? Now I would say, well, I'm a writer and a publisher and a professor, and I'm a cyclist or whatever. And maybe a couple points later, I'd say, and I'm the father of Vinny and Jennifer's husband and the son of my father and so on. But what you're arguing is that had I been raised in a non-weird culture, those would be the first things I would say. And the least important thing is what I do for a living.
Right. And, I've spent a lot of time in the South Pacific and in remote places in South America. And one of the things that's striking is, like, when Americans get together, you'll often say, hey, what do you do? Like, ask people about their occupation. That's downright rude in a lot of places, because it's not an important topic. It's not necessarily your business in other places. Whereas with us, our occupation is very central and a kind of the main place we're going to start to connect.
Almost as if how uncomfortable we would be if at a dinner party someone said, well, how much do you make? I'd be like, what? You can't ask that. You can ask me what I do. Like, what do you do? I'm a writer. Okay. How much do you make as a writer? What?
What'd you bring down last year?
Yeah. Let me see your tax returns. Oh, no. That's a different subject. And then, so talk a little bit about the Max Weber's Protestant work ethic and the rise of capitalism, that whole thesis. That's probably one of the most famous theories in all of sociology for a century now. You're parallel to that a little bit, but you tweak it quite a bit. Give us your thoughts on that most famous theory.
Yeah, so Max's idea that there was some things about Protestantism, so deferral of gratification, willingness to work hard, a number of other psychological traits that kind of may have facilitated the development of capitalist economics, of the kind of competitive market economics that came to dominate the world. And so I think that there's new evidence actually that supports that. Maybe less, Max didn't get it entirely right. For example, reading seems to play a big role. So the spread of Protestantism encouraged and fostered and drove the spread of literacy, which changes our brains and allows us to exchange information and people to swap ideas through learning to read. So that may have had a big role. There does seem to be something about hard work being purifying. So you can either see hard work as very painful, or you can see it as a way of working through your guilt or making you feel better or improving yourself or building your individualistic attributes. But then what I do with Max is to say that how did we ever get to a place where we could have a religion that said that each individual has the right and the duty to read the sacred scriptures for themselves and make judgments about the divine and about how he should live his life, and that saw work as a calling, an occupational calling, which is part of Protestantism. So a lot of the book is like sort of getting to Weber. Mm-hmm. And you need a world where those ideas would take off and be interesting and spread.
And could that have happened without Catholicism in the first place? I don't mean you need a Catholicism to have a Protestant Reformation, but the ideas behind Protestantism you just mentioned could only have derived after the Catholic Church put the brakes on polygamy and all those other family structures.
That's the idea, is that it created a world where people were psychologically predisposed to the ideas that Protestantism had to offer. And I mean, one line of evidence that I offer for that, although there was a big takeoff after 1517 and Martin Luther, there were a number of prior kind of bubbling up of Protestant-like ideas. So there's this thing in the Netherlands called the Brotherhood of the Common Life. And that was very much a Protestant-y type of movement, although it got embedded into the Catholic Church and just became kind of a branch or a sect of the Catholic Church. So they operated within the system, but they had an emphasis on literacy and on the importance of education and on individuality. So it was going to bubble up somewhere.
Interesting. So these things happen, and then literacy, our brains are rewired, and then let's go through some of these kind of famous psychological universal characteristics that are maybe not so universal that you talk about: conformity, shame and guilt, illusions, loss aversion, cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias. I mean, I've written about all these things as if this is a human trait. And you point out, well, it's more of a weird trait. These are dials that are up and down.
Yeah. So, I mean, take something like the endowment effect. So people have strong intuitions about the endowment effect usually. So if you own something, you think it's more valuable than if somebody else owns it. So the classic experiment is this: you give people a mug, and when you give it to them and they own the mug for a little while, the price they think willing to sell it for is higher than the price they're willing to buy it for if someone else has it. It's why, it's one explanation people have given for why you're always disappointed in how much your house sells for. Because it's your house. Yeah. You sort of place an extra, I've lived here and it's mine. Yeah. And so that somehow it seems more valuable. So you're always disappointed in the actual market price. But when Corinne Apicella and colleagues went and did this with Hadza hunter-gatherers, so these are people living in a style of life that we think is the way humans live deep into our evolutionary history, nomadic bands and whatnot. She found no endowment effect amongst the traditionally living Hadza. When she looked at Hadza that had become more engaged in the market, they showed an endowment effect, not quite as strong as in the West, but it was clear that they had an endowment effect, and you would have said, well, there's some cultural variation in the endowment effect. But turns out that the traditional Hadza, it's zero. They're just rational traders.
Interesting. Here's what I wrote about your research in my book, The Moral Arc, which was 2015, from your 2010 study published in Science, Markets, Religion, Community Size, and the Evolution of Fairness and Punishment. I love this study. Psychologist Joseph Henrich and his colleagues engaged over 2,000 people in 15 small communities around the world in two-player exchange games in which one subject is given a sum of money equivalent to a day's pay and is allowed to keep or share some of it, all of it, with another person. You might think that most people would just keep all of the money, but in fact, the scientists discovered that people in hunter-gatherer communities shared about 25%, while people in societies who regularly engage in trade gave away about 45%. Although religion was a modest factor in making people more generous, the strongest predictor was market integration, defined as the percentage of a household's total calories that were purchased from the market as opposed to homegrown, hunted, or fished. Why? Because the authors conclude trust and cooperation with strangers lowers transaction costs and generates greater prosperity for all involved, and thus market fairness norms evolved as part of an overall process of societal evolution to sustain mutually beneficial exchanges in contexts where established social relationships, for example, kin, reciprocity, and status, were insufficient. Now, that supports what you're talking about in your new book, but I was writing about it in a different context. That is, most theists and theologians argue, well, you need religion to be moral and religion to create a moral structure for people to be more fair. Otherwise, they're just, in a Dawkins type, just selfish, greedy, nasty, in a Hobbesian kind of human nature. And so you need religion to ride herd on that and make people be nicer. But what you're arguing, as I interpreted it, was actually just the opposite. Religion's not doing it. It's this integration with markets, with exchange. But I see now what you're doing is a deeper foundation. That is, people would otherwise trust one another within families, but once you branch out from that, you need something like markets that guarantee the exchange of money, the value of money, and so on. Anyway, I thought you'd appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the way I think of it is, I guess maybe I don't know if I'm in between, but we can find an independent effect of markets, even if you hold religion constant, greater market integration. People seem to have these market norms. They've gotten accustomed to dealing with strangers. They expect fairness. They're relatively fair in economic exchanges. So that's part of the story of what happened in Europe with the breakdown of the family. You get the rise and spread of all these impersonal markets. So in the book, I provide data showing the diffusion of an increasing number of market exchanges where people were closer and closer and could more routinely engage in this exchange with strangers, which lead to this impersonal prosociality where you're prosocial with people you don't know and might not see again, as opposed to focusing all your prosociality on this network of long and enduring ties you have. Although, as I point out in the book, I have a chapter on religion, and religion can do work along those lines as well. So if you unconsciously remind people of supernatural beings and they're a believer, it doesn't work on atheists, but if they're a believer, then they'll be more fair-minded if that supernatural agent is, preaching kind of be nice to co-religionists or whatever.
Is this like the big gods theory of the origins of religion? That is, you have kind of a joint evolution of religion and government when bands and tribes coalesce into chiefdoms and states, and there's just too many people in the population for these informal small group norms to take place. So you need some kind of higher authority. And so if the government gendarmes are not seeing you, there's an eye in the sky that sees everything you're doing. And you will, and ultimately in the next life, there'll be a cosmic courthouse.
And so it's the idea that cultural evolution is looking for ways to scale up. And one of the tricks that it can pull out of the toolbox are these eye in the sky, the invisible agent that will monitor and punish. And, this fits in with evolutionary psychology in the sense that I think, we're very concerned about our reputation. We behave better when we're being watched. So if cultural evolution can create an invisible being, which it can do because we have a very strong theory of mind, our ability to project minds, we construct models of other minds. So it's easy enough to make up a pretend one. And then that can do some work in getting people to cooperate.
Let me give you just kind of an overview of how I was thinking about your book as I was reading it, and how I think about any of these problems in which you have an idea and then you go in search of historical examples to fit it, which can work. And I think you're probably right the way you construct it. But I think of it as a 2x2 matrix, like psychologists like to use. They have 4 cells. So in cell 1, let's put the influence of Catholicism and then Protestantism, and that leads to weird characteristics like us. Then in cell 2, you have Catholicism and Protestantism, but you have countries where you have non-weird characteristics. And then in cell 3, you have non-Catholic, non-Protestant countries who end up weird. And then you have, of course, cell 4, non-Catholic in Protestant countries, and then non-weird characteristics. So certainly your book is focused on cell 1, where you can see the effects of that quite strongly. Are there examples where there are Catholic and Protestant influences where they didn't develop democracy, capitalism, and the kind of Western way of thinking?
Well, it's my approach and the approach, so one of the main kind of inquiries into this was published in Science last year, and it's a statistical approach, right? So I think these things are affected by lots of things. So, I have this idea that this kinship intensity is a big factor, but that's not only affected by the Catholic Church, it's also affected by things like whether you have irrigation agriculture or, the details of the kind of agriculture you can do, plow versus paddy rice. So one of the things I do in the book is I look at China and I just compare different Chinese provinces. So this is building on Thomas Talhelm's work. And when you have paddy rice agriculture, you end up with more clans, and that leads to more inclusive fitness. Inclusive or intensive kinship type psychology. So tighter bonds, more holistic thinking, more nepotism, things like that.
Yeah. The other thing.
So there's lots of things that can shape these institutions. I'm just putting my finger on a few that I think are particularly important for understanding the
I think they are, and I think you make a pretty good case for it, for sure. And I hadn't really thought about religion's influence historically in the way that you did. That appendix you have, where you have the list of all the edicts and so on in the history of Catholicism and Protestantism that alter the family structure, it's quite striking. I had no idea about half of those. All the intricate rules about not marrying your stepmother after the father dies or whatever, not marrying your sister and second cousin, first cousin, sixth cousin. And that now puts into context Pope John Paul II's edict that says it's okay to marry first cousins or second cousins? I forget. That was like in the 1990s.
I think it's second,
Now, genetically, by the way, what is...
People don't realize it. I was just going to say, people don't realize it, but it's embedded in our language. So when you say your sister-in-law, you're saying your sister in canon law.
Oh, right.
And it's saying, that woman is like your sister, so no sex or marriage with her. If your wife dies, you can't marry her.
What is the latest on, genetically speaking, marrying first cousins?
Yeah, I mean, you can detect, so inbreeding can have some effect on, things we care about, cognitive abilities and whatnot. The social effects on things like the inclusivity on the psychological effects seem to be a lot larger. It also depends on how inbred your population is.
Yeah.
But so the interesting thing the church did is it wasn't just the first cousins. It went all the way out to 6 cousins at one point. So that really means you're looking for someone distant from you. I make the case in the book, and I could use some more evidence on this, that this may have been where Europe's tribes went. So we know that Europe in the Roman era had all these tribes. You got the Celts and the Lombards and the Franks, and they all vanish. And one reason they may have vanished is anthropologists know that the thing that gets rid of tribes is marriage across tribal lines. So you had to marry someone who you weren't related to, but they had to be a Christian. So I suspect you had Christians who were of different tribes marrying, and then that blurs the boundaries, and then they just disappear into history.
Yeah, there seems to be some balance of how much genetic diversity a group needs from the outside to be healthy without too much inbreeding. And remember the famous T-shirt test that undergraduate women smelled some guys' T-shirts and then decided which ones they would want to go out on a date with or whatever. And genetically, it turned out they were somewhat distant, but not too distant genetically or something. I forget the details of that.
Yeah. There was it also depended on whether you were pregnant or not. So if you were pregnant, then you like the smell of your kinfolk's T-shirts. The idea that once you're pregnant, it doesn't matter. You just want to bond with your close relative.
That's funny.
But there is a study from Iceland that shows that you actually maximize your fitness like second and third cousins, because you can get the benefits of this close family and this network effect with not very much on bad inbreeding effects. So first cousins are definitely bad, but second and third cousins could be like a maximum. And then you go further away, you don't get the network benefits.
Interesting. Okay, another thing I was thinking about reading your book is the problem of over-determining the past. And so here's just a few examples of books I've read over the last few years that kind of this big history perspective on the past, which I love. I think it's great. And your book is right in that genre beautifully. So there's Jared Diamond's Geographic Models, which of course you're familiar with. Ian Morris's book, War, What Is It Good For? So his subtitle is Conflict and the Progress of Civilization from Primates to Robots. So here you go. Okay, we need war to generate. Matt Ridley's The Evolution of Everything, How New Ideas Emerge. His whole thing is ideas have sex. And that this is what drives civilization's progress. And Robin Dunbar, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. So, of course, Dunbar's number and all that. The economic historian Gregory Clark, The Farewell to Alms, in which he tackles the profound, I'll just read you the summary of it here, the profound questions and suggests a new and provocative way in which culture, not exploitation, geography, or resources, explains the wealth and poverty of nations. Countering the prevailing theory that the Industrial Revolution was sparked by the sudden development of stable political, legal, and economic institutions, 17th century Europe, Clark shows that such institutions existed long before industrialization. He argues instead that these institutions gradually led to deep cultural changes by encouraging people to abandon hunter-gatherer instincts, violence, impatience, and the economy of effort, and adopt economic habits, hard work, rationality, and education. I mean, I've got several other examples, but and here I've just been tasked with reviewing Benjamin Friedman's forthcoming book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. He's your colleague at Harvard in the economics department. Contrary to the conventional historical view of economics as an entirely secular product of the Enlightenment, Benjamin Friedman demonstrates that religion exerted a powerful influence from the outset. He makes clear that the foundational transition in thinking about what we now call economics, beginning in the 18th century, Adam Smith, was decisively shaped by the hotly contended lines of religious thought within the English-speaking Protestant world. Beliefs about God-given human character and about the afterlife and about the purpose of our existence were well under scrutiny in the world in which Adam Smith arose, and so on. It seems like you can find a thesis that works. Like this is a factor that changed history. Absolutely. And then tons of examples with the 4 cells, and the one stands out. Yep, okay, maybe statistically speaking, that's probably right. And I think you're right on the path you chose. But how do we know which? If you were to run a multivariate correlational analysis, which ones account for the variance the most?
Yeah, so I loved your examples because I know all those books, and I taught Wealth and Poverty of Nations when I was a professor of economics at the University of British Columbia. So I've actually taught Farewell to Alms. And all of those books you can find in my book. It's kind of a big plug.
No,
but
okay.
you know what I say about Jared Diamond, great explanation up to year 1000. But then, that explains why Islamic societies were so successful. How do we get to Europe? How do we get to England, the Industrial Revolution? So that's in there. Matt Ridley's book has ideas about innovation. So I have a chapter on innovation, about what drove innovation. And I think Matt's totally right. I've written about this myself. And but the key is you have to have trust in strangers, tolerance, interest in novelty. All of those things open up the floodgates of information among the minds of individuals. So my argument for the Industrial Revolution and innovation after about 1500 is that the change in psychology and the sort of broader social network. So journeymen would go from one apprentice shop or from one master's shop, say with some trade, to another one. They would take knowledge and recombine it with the folks in the next shop, and they were able to move over large distances. That's just one example of how information was flowing. So, I mean, Matt's idea is in there, but you got to say, well, what released that information such that we got this flurry of information? And Clark's idea was that there's this cultural change, but he doesn't have a good mechanism. So I actually used some of Clark's data in one of my chapters where he has this data on interest rates. And he claims that people are becoming more patient as time goes by. So I use that, and you combine it with other data, show that when people engage in markets, they become more patient. So his decline there, I think that's maybe a product of market integration, perhaps some Protestantism mixed in there at various points. You can show that Protestants predict being more patient, just compared to Catholics within Europe, for example. So I'm in conversation in some sense with all those guys, and I think a lot of the dots actually connect, at least with those books.
Yeah, maybe think of your book as a deeper level still to account for some of the causal mechanisms behind those other factors that these other authors are talking about. Here's another example: Rodney Stark's book, The Victory of Reason: How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success. You can guess why people send me this one, because I'm always pretty critical of religion. But he writes, Christianity and its related institutions are in fact directly responsible for the most significant intellectual, political, scientific, and economic breakthroughs of the past millennium. In Stark's view, what has propelled the West is not the tension between secular and non-secular society, nor the pitting of science and the humanities against religious belief. Christian theology, he asserts, is the very font of reason. Anyway, so of course, my critics send me these things. So here's how I described this thesis, which is even more starkly outlined by Dinesh D'Souza, the conservative activist, in his book, What's So Great About Christianity. There's no question mark on there. It's just a statement. So here in my sort of 4-cell analysis, I said, once again, we can run the historical experiment and make a prediction. If this hypothesis is true, then societies in which Christianity is or was the dominant religion should show Western-like forms of democracy and capitalism. They don't. The Byzantine Empire, for example, was predominantly Eastern Orthodox Christian from the early 8300s, and for 7 centuries produced nothing remotely like democracy and capitalism as practiced in modern America. Even early in America wasn't like it is today, when a mere 2 centuries ago, women couldn't vote, slavery was legal and widely practiced, and capitalism's wealth was vouchsafed to only a tiny minority of landholders or factory owners. Throughout the late Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, all nation-states, city-states, and various political conglomerates of Western and Central Europe were not only Christian, but Western Christian, and yet as late as the 19th century, the only quasi-democratic republics in Europe were England, Holland, and Switzerland. In Christian Europe, both England and Spain profited handsomely from their overseas colonial empires, made more profitable yet by the decimation of the native populations and the looting of their troves of precious metals, gems, and other natural resources, actions that by today's moral standards would be condemned. So again, it's in the exceptions to the rules that you can test these kind of historical hypotheses.
Yeah, so I think that's right. And so you know from my book that I'm very interested in the Byzantine Empire and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So you can compare those side by side, and because it was the West that really adopted this marriage and family program with these extensive taboos on cousin marriage. And so when you run the analysis, you often get like a light effect for Eastern Christianity and this strong correlation for Western Christianity. So you can catch that. And in my case, I have a theory, right? As it pinpoints a particular fact, the obsession with not having sex and incest taboos and a few other things in in one branch of Christianity that did some of the work here. And it doesn't mean that it initiated this process that I describe in the book.
Yeah, I hope your book is widely read by historians of these various periods to see how it holds up there. But let's talk about some of the other fun topics in here. You have a discussion of food taboos, like the Fijian tribe where pregnant women don't eat eels. To Western ears, this all sounds like crazy talk, like you shouldn't mix fabrics or you shouldn't mix blood and milk or whatever. But some of these may have a kind of evolutionary logic, or at least a physical or medical logic behind them.
Yeah, so that's an example from my last book, The Secret of Our Success. And that's where I really sketch out this idea that we're a cultural species and that we have these adaptive ways of learning from others. We tend to focus on, say, more successful or more prestigious. We key in on certain kinds of ideas. And that over generations, that can produce adaptations, so complex patterns of behavior that the individuals themselves don't understand. And so in one of my chapters in that book, I lay out a bunch of examples, and one is this Fijian food taboo, where the food taboos protect women from ciguatera, which accumulates in certain species of reef fish. Yeah. So anybody who's dependent on reef species can get ciguatera, and it's particularly bad if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. So it can affect the fetus or pass to infants through the mother's milk. So these taboos get invoked, which prevent women from eating these particular species during this dangerous period.
You think they developed that through trial and error? I mean, not just them, but most of these religious food taboos?
Well, I don't think that they. I think it's mostly copying more successful and healthier people. So you imagine if you lose a few children from eating the wrong fish, you don't do well, then your family doesn't grow big, it doesn't prosper, and as long as you tend to copy women who are doing well, have lots of large families and whatnot, you're going to get a kind of filtering process that's going to give you a better and better repertoire that allows you to avoid these things that make you unsuccessful. Because we did a lot of interviews on whether people were experimenting with this, and there was very little individual level experimentation. And we also found the same thing in Fijian ethnographies from the 1930s. So this was something that evolved to be widespread.
Yeah, I'm going to read another passage from your book that really struck me. This is toward the end. Globalization and its discontents. I like that subtitle because that's a hot topic these days. The much heralded ideals of Western civilization, like human rights, liberty, representative democracy, and science, aren't monuments to pure reason or logic. As so many assume, people didn't suddenly become rational during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries and then invent the modern world. Instead, these institutions represent cumulative cultural products born from a particular cultural psychology that trace their origins back over centuries through a cascade of causal chains involving wars, markets, and monks to a peculiar package of incest taboos, marriage prohibitions, and family prescriptions. You call that the MFP. What's the MFP again? That the Marriage Family Program.
Marriage and Family Program.
Catholic Church should actually adopt that. That developed in a radical religious sect, Western Christianity. The Christian leaders who repeatedly beefed up, implemented, and enforced the MFP as ecumenical councils over centuries revealed no long-term instrumental vision for how they'd create a new kind of world, though they no doubt had some non-religious motives in addition to the genuine desire to serve a powerful supernatural being. Anyway, it goes on like that. I mean, we often think, people like Steve Pinker and I write about, the importance of science and reason, starting around in the Enlightenment, overthrowing these religious superstitions like, women cavorting with demons in the middle of the night causes disease and plagues and storms and accidents. And we've replaced all that with meteorology and insurance and study of statistics. And we understand the natural world now. But you're saying that no one sat down and said, let's just create this process. It was already underway through these long historical trends.
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things I try to show in the book is how both law and science is affected by a kind of individualistic and dispositional way of thinking. So just thinking about how you begin to do science, you assign properties to objects. So you define an object, whether it's a planet, you assign a gravity. If it's a atom or a particle, you might assign a charge to it, and then you explain its behavior by that property. You don't focus on the relationships. The same thing with laws. You pick an individual, you assign rights to that individual, and those rights or responsibilities then define everything that goes from there. You're looking for an overall analytic system. You're not doing case by case, kind of a mosaic of different rules for different kind of cases. You're looking for generalized universal things. And you see that occurring in both law and science at the same time. And that's very much like analytic thinking and individualistic psychology. It's just about how we parse the world and try to explain things. It doesn't mean that science isn't a superior system of epistemology. It just means that you can see the tracks of the psychology that led to it.
Yeah, Jared's got a discussion of witchcraft in one of his books. I think it's Collapse. That they would often understand that the reason the little hut collapsed or whatever was because of termites. They understand the natural cause, but it's the timing of the collapse of the I forget which village this was. That they are impugning supernatural influence on. So they kind of had a blending of that, but they got some of it right. But yet it still served a purpose for accounting for these other unknowns. Yeah, so here your book is...
Yeah, that's actually something I've been puzzling.
Okay, go ahead, please.
It's just why witchcraft vanished when it did in Europe. And one thing that may play a role is zero-sum thinking. So places that have a lot of witchcraft tend to have a lot of zero-sum thinking. So if I get better, you get worse. So there's a limited amount of good in the world, and we're kind of deciding how to allocate that. Whereas once you have markets and you have technology evolving rapidly, then you're in a non-zero-sum world. So if I get rich, it doesn't mean you can't get rich, right? So there's this. Anyway, that may have played a role in making these ideas less appealing.
Yeah, my explanation.
So there's a lot of envy in witchcraft,
Yeah, that's right. Well, and a lot of the witch crazes were driven by greed and motives to get rid of people and enemies, people you didn't like, and enemies, and so on. Although behind it is the idea that there's a poor understanding of causality, why things happen. It's probably a combination of both, but it's a fascinating subject. But we often think of, where someone like Thomas Jefferson will say, well, I got these ideas from John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and they came up with this idea, well, we have to have a separation of powers and a representative government and a social contract and those sorts of things. So I don't think you're denying that somebody came up with those. I mean, Hobbes made this long, massive argument for why we need a state because of human nature and so on. But I think what you're saying is that wouldn't have taken hold in a different kind of culture. You need the kind of analytical Western thinking to even accept that idea as valid or even talk about it.
Right. So, and it's particularly catchy. So if you already think of individuals as having properties and dispositions, personalities are important when you're explaining people's behavior, then the idea of endowing them with rights or things like that makes a lot more sense. And it's also the case, just as a matter of the kind of evolution of these things, in the High Middle Ages, long before Jefferson and Locke show up on the scene, there's already like town councils where you're a citizen of the town, you have certain rights, you can't be impressed by the local duke. So, these things are already operating at a small scale. Locke and the guys are just kind of scaling up to the state.
Yeah. Yeah, your book is pretty descriptive, not prescriptive, but I also have a sense that democracy and the rule of law and equal treatment under the law and science and reason are better ways for communities to be structured. That is that Western way. Here I'm just speaking prescriptively now. In large populations of mostly anonymous strangers, you need those structures to have the built-in trust that is not going to be there without those family ties. I don't know if you want to speculate prescriptively from your book. You don't have to, but that is a pretty timely issue socially.
I mean, the book certainly makes the case. It's not shy about making the case that these tolerance, trust in strangers, interest in novelty, openness to immigrants, all these things drive more rapid economic growth. They drive innovation. So, if you want your economy to have that, then, and these aspects of psychology are good. But, there is a cautionary note in that this work by Alberto Alesina, Paolo Giuliano, two economists who have looked at family ties, they show that having weak family ties, they come to the same conclusions as I do, except they also study happiness. And so the happiest people are people who live in prosperous societies that have these values, but then have tons of family ties. So family ties do make us happy.
Yeah, that's some of that cultural psychology, like Michelle Gelfand, who is on the podcast. I love that whole tight culture, loose culture. How does that fit into your model?
Well, so that's one of the features of psychology that I aspire to explain. I think there are lots of things that can lead to tightness, including things like war shocks and pandemics and things like that. But it is also the case that this intensive kinship will make the society tighter. So one point I show this relationship across countries, that countries with more intensive kinship are tighter. It's a pretty strong relationship.
And does that hold up even, say, within Western European countries where you have differences, say, between Germans and Italians in tightness and looseness?
Yeah, so I haven't found a good measure of tightness that would allow me to address that. I'd love to know that. The only thing we have is what Michelle published in her science paper. We took her data and ran it through our analyses.
Right.
So it's just cross-national data. So it's very preliminary.
So as you talked about happiness, let's talk about meaningfulness. I love this sentence in your book. Then you get to Westerners who are like, I'm an individual ape on a pale blue dot in the middle of a giant black space. What does it all mean? So I love the reference to Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, of course. But I think what you're saying is a non-weird Western person wouldn't even be asking a question like that.
That's right. So in lots of places, people see themselves not only as connected in space through these social relations, and you can actually see this. So the cultural neuroscientists are studying this. When you have people think about the close members of their family, it actually overlaps with their self-concept in their brains. Think about yourself, think about your mom, think about these other relatives. Whereas in Westerners, these are separate. And you also think about yourself often as stretching into the past and stretching into the future. So you're kind of this web in this kind of temporal, spatial, interconnected mass. And so I think it gives your life meaning in a way that when you're just an individual trying to make his way in the darkness of space on the pale blue dot, it has a different feel.
As you probably know, in humanist and atheist skeptic communities, there's much discussion about, do we need to replace religion with something like a secular religion, like secular humanism or Western Buddhism or something, because people need this. What are your thoughts on in terms of human nature and to what extent we need religion or spirituality or something like that?
Well, I think now we're moving outside of the bounds of the book. I guess that I don't think you need religion. I don't have religion. But I think that you do need meaning in your life, and you do need goals, and you do need something bigger, or it helps if you're an individualist, to have things you're striving for. It's good to have people you're working with and sense of team. I'm a great believer in rituals. I think it's okay to sometimes just get together and do the same thing because we're the people who do this thing, whether it's depending on what your interests are. I think all that can help people deal with that kind of loneliness that I mentioned with the pale blue dot.
Yeah, well, I mean that bowling alone idea that we're kind of disintegrating from those old family ties that give meaning without even going down the road of existentialism and what does it all mean. You don't even need to ask that if you have a tight community of people. And how can secularists get it? Well, we can get it through lots of different ways of just having communities and people that you like. It's almost like what people are talking about is restructuring communities to be more like what you talk about early in the book about the way things used to be for 99% of human history. These small bands and tribes, we're kind of trying to reconstruct those through Facebook meetup groups or whatever. And so I could see there's kind of follow-up from your book of like what we can do to kind of recapture some of the positive aspects of that life.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I agree with all that, but I don't have any wisdom with that.
Well, there are, I don't know, there's many differences. There are atheists who think we need to construct, like actual churches, the equivalent of a church, a building to go to where you meet every week. And there are these meetup groups that do this, and they light candles and they have testimonials of how you lost your religion, and they have like dating services and funerals and marriage ceremonies that are all secular. I think in a way they're trying to recapture everything you're talking about. Here's another sentence.
Does it work?
Well, I don't know, because like personally for me, I don't really feel the need for any of that, but some people do. I mean, most of my Jewish friends, for example, are atheists. And yet they still hold tight to their, kind of Jewish heritage and the culture and the community and the rituals and so on, because, it's thousands of years old and it has kind of a deep resonance spiritually, whatever that really means. What were you?
Yeah, and real sense of community and being part of something.
What were you raised as?
I mean, I feel like I get a lot of that because I'm part of this scientific community. And so, we get together at conferences and we think we're doing something important and we're changing how people think about humans. And
right. I mean, to me, the kind of work you do is, it's as grand as anything religion ever came up with. I mean, you want to understand human nature and all of human history all the way back to the beginning. That's pretty grand. That's kind of an awesome undertaking.
Yeah, no shortage of ambition.
Yeah, totally. How'd you get interested in all that in the first place? Where are you from? How were you raised? Give us a little bit of background.
Sure. So I am from Philadelphia. I was raised Roman Catholic, and I went to the University of Notre Dame.
You were raised Catholic.
So I don't think I ever made it.
That's great.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic. And as a high school student, going to Notre Dame was the best thing one could do. I mean, my father watched the football games. Everybody knew, all my friends were Catholics, or at least many of them. So that seemed like a great thing. And, just as I started to take the classes, I started to, I'm not sure this is making sense. I'm having some issues. And so by the time I graduated from Notre Dame, I was already an agnostic. I think by Richard Dawkins' definition, I was an atheist, but I was calling myself an agnostic. And then I actually met atheists when I went to graduate school.
Oh boy!
The first time I met.
Oh, you're one. Oh, that's what they look like.
Really?
Yeah. Go ahead. Anyway, then you were.
And so I started. I was interested in the evolution of human societies in graduate school, and I started doing field work in the Peruvian Amazon. And I just became really disenchanted with what anthropology had to offer me in terms of explaining people's decision making and the patterns I was seeing. I was looking at different indigenous groups that were in the same environment but behaving very differently. So then I got interested in cultural evolution, and I started working with the scholar Rob Boyd, who developed ideas about cultural evolution. And then I just, I kind of lost my discipline because I started reading in behavioral economics. I was reading Eleanor Ostrom's work from political science, Kahneman and Tversky. And then so by the time I graduated with my PhD, I, was applying to economics departments, psychology departments, and anthropology. And so I went to anthropology, but then I got recruited to the University of British Columbia in economics and psychology. And that's kind of very important. That idea, Matt Ridley, you mentioned ideas have sex. Well, moving among disciplines is a good way to pick up ideas from different disciplines, methods, the way people think about things and just kind of recombining them.
Yeah, I almost feel like we need to just break down the barriers in the academy, and literally physical barriers on campuses, buildings, walls, offices, and which classes are taught in which divisions. I mean, your book it's all of that. Evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, economics, behavioral economics, social psychology, neuroscience. I mean, it just goes on and on. You've had to dabble in a dozen different sciences just to try to answer these questions, not to mention history.
Right. So it's even built into the structure of the university. So, I'm at Harvard, there's the Division of Sciences where nobody studies humans except for my little department of human evolutionary biology, which is kind of this weird thing that other universities don't have. And then all the other human studiers are on the other side in the social sciences and humanities. And they're under separate subdeans. So other universities are the same way. Everybody who studies people is in one place. And then all the non-people scientists are in a different part of the university. Right. Even if you study other living things, the med school is a different story. But I
think Kahneman is the only psychologist to win a Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize for psychology or social sciences, just economics. Even that is very, I think, emblematic of the issue. It's almost like economics is the Nobel Committee thinks of it more like physics or mathematics or something like that, not one of those soft sciences. And yet, to me, the hard science is what you're doing, because there's so many variables. Talk about the three body problem in physics. How about the 3 million body problem in human psychology and sociology and so on? Not to mention, take it back historically, and then you have a block of a gazillion variables you have to control for. Here's another weird one that I picked up from your book. Weird people have flat feet, impoverished microbiomes, high rates of myopia, and unnaturally low levels of exposure to parasites like helminths, whatever those are, which may increase their risk of heart disease and allergies. So you even identify some of those physical characteristic differences. That's pretty wild.
Yeah. So one of the we just published a special issue on this in which there's a paper by Dan Lieberman and Mike Girvin that kind of detail all this. But the assumption has always been, well, our psychology is plastic, so maybe that's why you're seeing the psychological variation, but it's not hard biology. But it turns out if you look at things like people's feet, that develops, and it depends on what the social technologies are. So shoes make a big difference, and it causes you to get flat feet, and it does other things to your feet. Whereas, if you don't wear shoes like most humans did throughout human history, you get a different foot development, and you're able to run barefoot, and there's a bunch of other downstream things. The helminths, we evolved in a world where we had lots of parasites around. So these are kind of intestinal parasites. And our biology may have co-evolved with those. So this is Mike Girvin's idea and others. And one of the things that may lead to high heart disease in weird industrialized societies is that, we've been parasite free now for decades.
Right.
People don't go around with lots of parasites. And that's interesting because it may suggest, ways of treating it. Like maybe there's a way to get the benefits of the parasites without having to have parasites, which is very unpleasant, having had many myself.
I do.
Yeah. So human biology varies a lot too. The visual thing. If you grow up as a kid reading, your eyes calibrate in a way such that you get myopia. But if you never read, which most people didn't over human history, you don't get that.
By the way, you mentioned the reading, literacy, and theory of mind. I wrote about those early studies in the Moral Arc, but I haven't seen if there's been follow up on those have been replicated. That is, people that read high literature are better able to read the emotions in pictures of people's mouth and eyes, I think it was. And therefore literacy leads to this kind of analytical thinking and better able to, in a way, kind of a moral Flynn effect, where we've gotten better morally at projecting ourselves into somebody else's mind to see what it would feel like if we did that to them, kind of a golden rule thing. What's the latest on that?
Yeah. So I dipped into that when I was writing that prelude chapter, and it seems to me where the evidence is good is the correlation. So people who engage and read more fiction are better at doing empathy. That seems to hold. The tricky part is the experimental stuff. So they've tried to kind of like prime people or kind of do kind of smaller scale experiments where they try to get people to be either more empathetic or less empathetic by reading some fiction and then answering the questions. And those seem to be a bit dodgy. So not all those replicate. So I mean, what we really need is the big study where you have two groups and you randomly assign. One group reads a lot of fiction, another group reads like technical manuals, and then you give them empathy tests after a semester or something like that.
Right. Maybe we don't know which direction the causal arrow points on that front yet.
Right. Because it could be that people self-select into they like reading fiction because they're good empathizers. I mean, my bet is that it probably does have some effect, but the data is still equivocal.
Right, and one of those studies made a distinction between so-called high literature, like reading a Jane Austen novel, where there's a lot of kind of meta analysis of, he said that she thought that he went and he liked her, and then it's sort of much more complicated than reading, some lowbrow, say trash romance books or something like that. I don't know if anybody's following up on the different kinds of literature that have those effects.
Yeah, I didn't run across anyone making that distinction recently.
Okay, a couple other things. Well, actually, I know we've been going over an hour, and you have a lot of other interviews to do. But a couple things I like to ask biologists and people that are doing the kind of work you do. Group selection. Do you need group selection? What are your thoughts on group selection? It gets resurrected every 10 years or so, and there seems to be no resolution on that.
Well, I think the big distinction I like to make is between genetic group selection and cultural group selection.
Okay.
So genetic group selection, humans are well mixed, and especially the way humans expand and compete, when one group defeats another group, they often, will kill all the men and take the women in, which is going to cause massive remixing of the genes. So at the level of genetic group selection, it doesn't seem very likely to me. The key statistic would be FST. So genetic FSTs don't look like they would support very much genetic group selection. But at a cultural level, cultural is inherited and transmitted in a different way. So if migrants come into a cultural group, they'll acquire the local culture, and especially the children will be indistinguishable. Think of accents or something like that, will be indistinguishable from the rest of the group. So unlike genes, where the kids would have the genes of the parents, and you can't just overwrite those the way you can in culture. And people use conformity and things like that when they're learning in cultural groups. So cultures can be much more like units. And when we calculate cultural FSTs, which is the key statistic, it's really big. It's much bigger than we see with genetic evolution. And then, of course, we have lots of historical examples where one cultural group, because of its institutions, the technologies afforded by those institutions, they're able to spread at the expense of that. So in The Secret of Our Success, I go through lots of cases of the expansion of one cultural group amongst hunter-gatherers at the expense of other cultural groups who had different institutions. So I think so I guess I have a mixed position, which is I don't think genetic group selection is very likely. I do think cultural group selection is probably an important
What about things
factor.
like music, dance, even language, perhaps, as a kind of a byproduct of bringing groups together, making them more socially unified, stronger against other groups? It doesn't have to be genetic group selection. Or, the debate, is music just this, an adaptation, or is it a cheesecake, as Steve Pinker calls it, an accidental byproduct, a spandrel, as it were?
Yeah, so I think that both can be true. So it could be that it's a kind of cheesecakey thing. People like it. They do it in ways that appeal to others. So that's great. But it's certainly the case. There's a lot of evidence when you do a communal ritual and people dance rhythmically and they match each other's body patterns, and you can use music to sync that up. They get more cooperative. They get more bonded. They become stronger socially. And I think lots of societies have used those communal rituals to build solidarity. And so they could be culturally group selected. There seem to be a lot of rituals built around building solidarity amongst groups and creating bonds with more distant groups. So there are these age set rituals that lots of hunter-gatherers have where you bring young men together and you put them through these terrifying rites. And that seems to bond those men. It gives them bonds that persist after they split back up. So it's possible that it's both cheesecake and then it can be harnessed by this intergroup competition, by cultural evolution.
Yeah, as you know, David Sloan Wilson has an argument. Well, he likes the group selection, but again, it can be cultural, I think, for his thesis to hold that religions are a kind of a bonding effect socially that leads to more cooperation and keeps the brakes on too much competition. And I also wanted to ask you about the decline of violence. So, of course, Steve Pinker's big book on that. The Better Angels of Our Nature, but also Richard Wrangham's recent work on self-domestication, that, we moved away from being more chimp-like in our violence and more, let's say, bonobo-like because of this self-domestication process. Give us your thoughts on that big picture, since you're a big history thinker.
Yeah, sure. So in my previous book, my 2015 book, The Secret of Our Success, there's a chapter called Self-Domestication. And there I make the case that the self-domestication process that my colleague Wrangham describes was actually initiated by the evolution of social norms. So you break a social norm like food sharing or like, exploiting someone else in your group, stealing from them, you get a bad reputation, and then people punish you in various ways. They might disassociate with you. They might actually beat you. And this is a process where, if you're too aggressive, too much reactive aggression, you don't comply with the social norms, you get selected out. And so Wrangham goes through, executions and various kind of the extreme end of this process. But so that suggests that it's a real force. And so I think one of the reasons that humans are docile, we're able to live in large groups, interact with each other in ways that other species aren't, is because we went through this gene culture coevolutionary process where there were norms that suppressed violence and required certain kinds of behavior. And then people who didn't comply got punished in various ways. And that led to this self-domestication process.
Yeah, one of the eye-opening books I read researching the moral arc was Christopher Boehm's book on the moral origins, the origins of moral. I forget what the title was, but he has that database of how hunter-gatherer groups handle bullies and free riders and really psychopaths. And man, that's crazy. Where they take the last step, you take the guy out for a hunt and you come back without him. but he shows how hard it is to kill somebody, capital punishment essentially, how hard it is to kill somebody, especially if they're a big, nasty, psychopathic bully. And therefore you need 12 or so guys to, all pile on this, the whole group. And that also kind of diffuses any kind of guilt you'd have about killing somebody, something like that.
Right. And it diffuses guilt. So also, if any members of the family want to kind of reply in kind or take revenge, they've got to take revenge. There's not one target.
Yeah. Because
So so that fits into what I constructed in The Secret of Our Success. My response to your question about Steve's picture is something I take on in the new book. So and I think Steve would agree with this, that there was an increase in people's self-regulation in interacting with strangers. And so I use that as I decline in murder rate. I actually used some of this, I draw on the same sources as Steve to show that there's this big decline in murder in Europe. And I think that's a measure of rising levels of self-control in these certain kinds of social contexts. So it's the cultural evolution of this certain psychology. And the case I make is that this is the psychology you need when you have to be, it's the kind of the businessman psychology. You have to be able to bargain in a peaceful way. You can't be known as a hothead. Mm-hmm. It's bad for business, basically. And this domesticates. Not in the genetic sense, but in the cultural sense, it favors greater self-regulation.
Yeah, I loved Steve's discussion of Norbert Elias's book, The Civilizing Process. His database was these books of customs and rules and norms of how you should eat and what you should dress and how you should behave around other people. Basically, our ancestors were just slobs. They were pigs. They were just, kind of uncouth. And that using utensils or not urinating in front of other people and not having sex in front of a bunch of people, all these kinds of things, they seem kind of trivial now because we take it for granted. But, Steve's argument is that this teaches self-control, sort of a delay of gratification. Wait for the 15 minutes so you get the 2 marshmallows. By the way, has the marshmallow test been tested in some of these other non-Western cultures and the kids are less likely to wait the 15 minutes to get the second marshmallow?
Well, it is variable. So there's some cross-cultural extensions of the marshmallow test that some African societies, the kids will wait even longer. So there's interesting cultural variation, although in general, there seems to be a mapping between the marshmallow test and these other measures of willingness to defer gratification. And there's quite a bit of variation around the world on that.
Interesting. Well, as I think it was Walter Mischel himself pointed out, if you grow up in a home where there's a bunch of kids, and if you wait the extra 15 minutes, there's not going to be any marshmallows left. So it could be a strategy. Delaying gratification is the worst thing you could do. It'd be
Yeah. So, and families were shrinking in Europe, for various reasons. But even by 1500, Europe had relatively small families and later marriage.
Yeah.
So kids were growing up in a world with fewer
Yeah.
siblings.
Okay, last big picture question. We're going to colonize Mars probably in our lifetime, and we'll become a multi-planetary species in the next century or two. And so 1,000 years from now, we may have these founder populations on different astronomical bodies, not just planets but moons. And who knows? Maybe in 1,000,000 years from now, we'll have colonized the Milky Way galaxy and have branched off into multiple Homo species. The lessons you would tell people to take to Mars to start off with from your research, like how would we structure a new society? We're going to start brand new. What would you recommend Elon send with his engineers or NASA or whoever that?
Well, here's what I would recommend, because I think institutional design is very difficult, but I would take a Darwinian approach. And so I would suggest that we try a whole bunch of different we set up different groups. And we let them pick their own institutions, and then we look and see which ones work, and then we keep transferring the ones that work until we create new recombinations of better institutions. So a variation selection.
I like that.
To figure out.
Yeah. As long as everybody has air and water.
It's a meta.
Yeah, I like that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine somebody, say, 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now saying, oh, democracy, oh, yeah, we tried that for a while, but we came up with this much better thing, and here it is. And it's like, oh, why didn't we think of that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how the technology, at some point we're all going to be interconnected. I don't know. Yeah. So there could be a whole new world we can't imagine.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, thanks for writing this book. Thanks for your work. I'm a longtime fan. What can you possibly do to top this massive tome, this magnificent work you did? What are you thinking about next?
Well, the main thing I'm thinking about these days is Matt Ridley just wrote a great one, but as a book on innovation. So I think I have some things to say about the collective. I call it the collective brain. So this is the idea that the key to invention is having a large and interconnected society.
Yeah, Matt was just on the podcast. Super interesting stuff about how innovation really works. It doesn't really match the models that we developed through the patent system, say. That awards the great man model of history. And he even had a funny story, because I made we were talking about intellectual property rights. And I said, well, if someone like J.K. Rowling, writes a novel about, talking owls or whatever, that's her invention. Somebody can't just rip it off. And he said, oh, talking owls, there's a long history of that in literature. Like, oh, so she got that from somebody else. And there's almost nothing new under the sun. Every little bit has already been done.
Yeah, no, everything is an element taken from here and recombined.
That's too funny.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think Matt's one of the great contributions of Matt's book is showing the power of that recombination and how there's very few individuals who really stand out if you look at if you think of them as just drawing on other sources.
Yeah, that's very good. Well, Joseph, thanks again for your time, and thanks for your work.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Talk to you soon.